The Spinoff Podcast Network.
Raising capital or taking your business to the world? Investment Fix has everything you need to make it happen. This season, we're exploring the US market, the opportunities it offers, what it takes to grow a business there, and the best way to approach investors. The Investment Fix podcast. Tune in today.
The Fold is brought to you by oOh!media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa. Kia ora and welcome to The Fold. My guest today is Justin Giovannetti, who is the Spinoff's new-ish, I wonder when you get to stop saying that, political editor. His whole story of how he got to the Spinoff is kind of incredible. He interviewed for the job remotely from Canada before lockdown, when the pandemic was just sort of it was not a twinkle in anyone's eye, but it hadn't obviously become what it became. And, you know, we gave him the job. He had to work out his notice with his employer, the Globe and Mail. And basically from that point on, the world went to hell. And we really wondered whether we were ever going to get him here. And Toby and I, once we went into lockdown, Toby Manhire, the Spinoff's editor, and I would have a beer every couple of weeks and he was in this apartment which was gradually emptying of furniture and ended up, you know, he was just drinking whiskey on a mattress by the end of it and still didn't know, despite having completely dismantled his life, whether he was even going to be allowed into New Zealand. Ultimately, by some miracle, he made it here and has really been a revelation for us. We'd never had anyone in the gallery before. It felt like a risk to have someone from outside of that culture who'd never reported in New Zealand. But I remember when we were sort of weighing up at the time, I read a bunch of his reporting for the Globe and Mail, and I loved his style. It was very clean, very just beautiful writing. But there was also this kind of cerebral quality to it. Like he just had command of facts. You'll actually hear on this podcast the way he sort of sets everything up, gives you the context, some things that should be natural to us as journalists, but we often forget. And I think one of the things I've loved about him is if you can only have one person in the gallery as still a relatively young site, having someone who approaches our politics with outsiders' eyes means they see different things. And we discussed quite a lot about how the reporting style in New Zealand is different from the one he left in Canada. So yeah, I think it's a fun listen. It's very, you know, we're recording this just prior to midday on Thursday. The campaign has been forever and oddly low energy. Certainly that's how it feels to me. Anyway, it's a really fun chat. I'm definitely going to have him up again because there was a lot we didn't get to, but I think you will enjoy it. So yeah, here's the Spinoff's political editor, Justin Giovannetti. Justin, welcome to The Fold. I say that with like this kind of dazed expression on my face because this campaign has been going forever and has exhausted even those of us who aren't particularly day-to-day working on it and in it like you are. How are you going?
I think I'm exhausted. I was a member of the gallery on the plane in, and it's like, you know, to go back a second, I was speaking to a member of the public service a few days ago, and they said they all had to take their vacation time over the last month or so just because their bosses have all told them that when this starts up again in another few days, Parliament's going to take off and it's going to be like a hard 100 days and they're going to want to go out the gate. And I was just, no, man. Like the leaders have to be absolutely shattered at this point. And I know for me, there was about a point 2 weeks ago where I just realized I was bagged. And it occurred to me I haven't actually had any time off since January 2nd, that I went back to work on January 2nd when the head of the Iranian Republican Guard got blown up by the U.S., and then there was ballistic missile strikes, and then they shot down an airliner, and then.
That just sounds like, you know, it's crazy because those are very intense events that should define a year as a reporter, and yet they seem almost quaint from the bit before time.
Forgettable. Just, yeah. I mean, and then I spent like a month. There was a whole slew of protests, and this is the biggest threat to the Canadian economy in February and March and before was groups allied with First Nations were shutting down the railroads across the country. The economy was coming to a halt. In the middle of the winter, parts of the country were running out of propane. This is Canada. They were literally going to freeze. And that was decades ago.
Yeah, and then a couple of other things happened, which we'll get to. I just wondered because you've covered a lot of campaigns, both sort of federal and national in Canada, and this is your first. You were just dropped into it cold, and it almost immediately started exploding. What is your sort of give us your assessment of how this very strange and both boring and kind of completely historic campaign has gone from your perspective?
There was a moment earlier this week where the Labour leader, Jacinda Ardern, had a big rally at Vic. I'm still not sure how to refer to that university, but
they're not either.
Yeah, big uni. And it occurred to me after the fact that COVID wasn't mentioned. Like it's almost like we're in the post-COVID election now, right? It's gone through so many different twists and turns, and now we're arguing about tax rates and what's true and what's not. It's been a bizarre campaign. And, there's the before campaign, then there was a campaign that was truncated by the return of COVID, and now there's been this kind of second campaign. It's been an odd campaign. I think that's the easiest way to just put it. And I've been kind of thinking about that. What hasn't happened? I guess I have a lot of thoughts on that, but it's not that different from some of the Canadian federal campaigns, kind of very central leader driven. It's very much a battle of Jacinda versus Judith. But it's been interesting. It has been interesting to me, like what issues have come forward and what hasn't, and just how we're 3 days now. There's 3 days left to vote. And seemingly no one is talking about COVID in the COVID election. Yeah. And that's a victory.
Well, I mean, that it's an implicit victory. It explains a lot of why Labour is polling so highly, right? Are there, you've been travelling around the country. Are there sort of moments or events that sort of stick in your mind that feel like they define the election and the sort of diverging fortunes of those two leaders?
Yeah, I do think that actually that rally for Labour earlier this week, and I wrote a quick piece about it. That was an accidental. Labour really went out of their way to create that moment. They wanted that moment, but it did certainly it did feel as though there was a turn there. I'll talk about the before times where I followed Judith Collins, National Leader Judith Collins, in the Wairarapa. And she had this town hall in Carterton. And it was great. It was packed, and they had great questions. I mean, the people in that town hall, honestly, that was one of the most enjoyable 40 minutes I've had in this country. Just really good, solid questions. Questions about everything from why is food so expensive, and why is this duopoly allowed to exist in our supermarkets, all the way through to the ETS. It was good, structured questions. It was excellent. And at that point, and Judith did a great job. She did. And a lot of people came out of there, and I thought we're really impressed. And so I came out of that thinking, well, this is a real race. It'll be interesting to see these two leaders go head to head. And then I think that kind of obviously it's still a real race, but I think what we've seen over the last couple of days is, National has certainly been building some sense of momentum, and Labour has been building some sense of momentum, and National's really been kind of knocked off their perch. And if Judith Collins was talking about the kind of things that people served up to her on a platter, saying these are the things that New Zealanders care about right now, which is our homes are too expensive, we're worried about our kids, we're worried about food, we're worried about childcare. If they kept hammering the government on that, that would have been such a different election from the one we're at right now, which is, we're talking about obesity and whether or not the Green Party's plan is the Labour Party's plan. So yeah, I think those were kind of two kind of like beginning first campaign, second campaign kind of tent pegs for me.
In as far as the relative, I mean, it's kind of at once both a known strength and was for a while anyway considered a knock on Jacinda Ardern was her sort of, she's a communications major, her degree of command or her abilities as a communicator. Just assessing the both parties. I mean, this is a media podcast, and I think it's interesting to me the way that parties, when they're really operating at a high level, have an ability to kind of control narrative and within the media. What's your sort of and conversely, when they're spinning out of control, like Nationals appears to be, the way they don't seem to have any ability to sort of strategically do what you just suggested and hold a message. What is your sense, as someone who was dropped into this environment pretty cold, about the way the two main parties, and forgive me, Alex Bray, for not talking about some of your beloved minor parties, but of the way the two main parties have sort of dealt with the media and sort of stage managed the campaign?
Yeah, I think the two big parties have actually done relatively good job of it, I'll be honest, in terms of dealing with the media. Labour's sort of been quite interesting in that they haven't been running the campaign you would like the really safe campaign in terms of the way that they deal with the media that you'd expect the front runner to do, which is their campaign manager, Hayden Monroe, is also their media manager. It's pretty odd. It's never happened in my career before that you're texting the campaign manager media questions. That's odd. It's a very kind of tight crew. When I was in Auckland a few weeks ago, and when I wanted to speak to Helen White, they're like, "Oh, just text Helen. Here's her number." That was odd as well. She didn't have someone there on her staff to deal with media questions. She was fielding them herself. National has kind of done a little bit more of that, where they've just kind of taken their operation that runs in Parliament and have just kind of moved it over to the campaign side, which I think serves them pretty well. I don't think their inability to kind of get their kind of message out in that way has anything to do with their media outreach. I think they've been pretty good. They've been pretty responsive. On election night, they're organized. I think that's just, like you were saying, their inability to hold a message. Some of the more minor parties have been a little more odd. New Zealand First in particular has been bizarre in terms of their media management, where they've been extremely hard to get a hold of. And, the Spinoff tried to have a sit-down interview with Winston Peters. And I've probably gone further with New Zealand First than any political party ever, anywhere, to try to deal with their concerns, and they kind of just blew us off after it wasn't enough. So it's been an interesting kind of lesson into New Zealand.
Do you want to talk a bit about what has surprised you about the sort of political media environment and the gallery, or what contrast that with what your experiences were in Canada?
Well, one of the things that actually kind of what I just mentioned is the fact that National was able to take their parliamentary crew and just put them to work in the campaign. There's in Canada and definitely in other English-speaking countries, there's generally a bit of a firewall between your kind of the side of your party that's paid for by taxpayers, and then the side of your party that's the partisan side. It's the side that should be paid for by donations. So, in Canada, say when the election is officially announced, you have to hand in your government phone. You have to turn off your government email, your parliament@gc.ca email. You stop working for the government for the length of the campaign. You can't be reached in that way. And that's like it took me a few days longer than it should have in New Zealand because I didn't want to email people at their Parliament, email address, assuming they wouldn't get it. And they do here. And it's been quite strange, even beyond that the government has continued to operate. And I don't mean obviously the government operates. The government operates everywhere in the world during an election campaign. But generally, they stop announcing almost everything. And the ministers kind of disappear. They are no longer ministers unless there's a natural disaster. The Labour government's been and NZ First they've been announcing things, regular things, up until last week. I mean, there may have been a few this week. That to me has been bizarre that you have ministers out there announcing funding in the midst,
feels incredibly political.
Yeah,
right?
during a campaign.
Yeah,
that is just odd to me. And so that kind of seamlessness between the two is quite bizarre. Maybe bizarre is not the right word, but I just find it unusual. In terms of the actual media side, yeah, I mean, there's taken some time to get used to that as well. I mean, in terms of I have found it interesting in terms of the way that some reporters here, most reporters generally, the way in which there's also a seamlessness there between your writing side and opinions. That reporters at Stuff say can write a really strong story one day, and then we'll have an opinion column the next day. That in Canada, at least, if you are a reporter, you don't have an opinion. I was a political reporter there for the one newspaper for 7 years, and I did not spout a single opinion during those 7 years. And I tried not to spout any on Twitter either. You try to go down the middle of the road. People get angry at you. You get called a shill or a cuck or whatever. But some days you anger everyone, and those are generally good days. But so there's been an element of that as well, where people can report the news straight and can have opinions here that I do find a little hard to kind of get used to the point that I've done that as well. Right? I've been asked, you guys, I've done that. It's still not totally natural to me. I don't have that muscle as well developed, and you see that a lot on the news as well. Tova, sometimes you want to have a little bit of spark, a little bit of color on television. I'm not going to criticize the people around me, but Tova O'Brien, I think she does a great job at what she's doing. I have nothing really bad to say about her professionally. But one of the first times that I saw one of News Hub's broadcasts, I was like, okay, we're not in Kansas anymore. And in ways, I thought the broadcast was much more enjoyable, and I think there's something that it says that kind of the sense of New Zealanders. I think they enjoy that kind of broadcast with a little bit more spice to it, and she still does really good. She has great sources. She is telling you what's happening. She's just kind of she's giving you a little bit of razzle dazzle as well. And I know that you certainly have thoughts in terms of RNZ. I can say that the radio side in New Zealand has been far more engaged than what I've seen in Canada, say with the CBC. That RNZ, especially with their interviews with the leaders, that Monday morning thing that Jacinda does where she does all the media, that's new. That's pretty cool. But yeah, RNZ in particular, I've thought has been interesting to see how they talk to the different leaders and how they treat them differently. It's certainly something that I know that the CBC in Canada, say as an example, struggles mightily to come across as nonpartisan, and they probably fail quite often. Not so much because they're partisan, but because it is an office. It's generally a company run by quite young people, in the middle of the country's biggest city, who just kind of don't realize that they aren't really speaking in ways that really appeals to the heartland. Sorry, this just kind of took
no.
off.
I think that's really interesting, and I think it's a very hard thing for media to grapple with, because it does largely have a young urban workforce which has the kind of values that cohort tends to have, and yet it is covering politics for a national audience in all its diversity, and I think both the state-funded and the private sector media is guilty at times of being too reflective of what the sort of current state of the values of its workforce, and not necessarily reflective of the rest of or large chunks of New Zealand are moving at a different pace, probably in the same direction, but just they're not where they were. But it's interesting what you say about the sort of the divide or the lack of one between opinion and reporting. I mean, because I think, like, I'm a huge admirer of the News Hub Political Gallery as a, I think that they have forced a lot of innovation, and you see there is a common thread to, this is well before you were here, obviously, but Duncan Garner, Patrick Gower, and now Tova as the sort of the heads of those institutions that they're absolutely, they just give you everything, and it makes it a very dynamic product. There are times when you wince and you sort of say, like, how do you come back from there to do straight reporting? And yet somehow I think for the most part I don't. While they are constantly accused of it online of bias, I don't really detect any personally, and it's difficult to do that, right? Because the Fold is brought to you by O Media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa, with over 4,000 out-of-home advertising sites nationwide across both street furniture and retail centres. I'm super grateful to O Media for enabling us to make unmissable connections with Kiwis.
Raising capital or taking your business to the world? Investment Fix has the lowdown on everything you need to make it happen. This season, we're exploring the US market, the opportunities it offers, what it takes to grow a business there, and the best way to approach investors. Join some of the superstars of the investment and business world as they share advice from their time in the US so you can make your mahi count in this massive market. The Investment Fix podcast, brought to you by Invest New Zealand. Tune in today.
If, you see this most intensely in the US, that if you have, two parties that you're trying to cover in a non-partisan way, but one of them has got a completely different set of behaviours, and, the line there is essentially obliterated for the Republicans, and the Democrats are sort of trying to figure out how to either, to hold it while also, not you kind of have to engage on some level. And you've seen the way, I think, I don't know how much you read the New York Times, but I feel like their reporting has, where the line is on reporting and opinion there has, you see a lot more judgment within what are nominally straight news stories, which is interesting. So let's talk a little bit about, because the Globe and Mail it's a kind of a closer to a New York Times for Canada, is that, or aspires to be? You're grinning.
They would love that. They certainly aspire to be that. That it is. Yes, my former employer, the Globe and Mail, is the highest circulation newspaper in Canada. This is where people from the Toronto Star get angry because they claim they have more. But it's the big national newspaper. It's the only real one left. There's a newspaper called the National Post, which tries to do that as well, but the Globe has correspondents kind of spread across the country from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and so they really do see themselves as that, and the really trying to hold a centrist kind of soft pro-business angle that they just try to be like straight reporting, and over the last couple of years with a really strong focus on investigations.
So tell me how you ended up there and why it was politics that got you as a reporter.
Yeah, it's a weird road. I give talks to J school students, and generally they hear from people who are a lot older than me, who give them kind of this, and then I was at the BBC, and just sort of
as if it just happens.
Yeah, it just happens. And I tell them, it doesn't just happen like that anymore. But I had a pretty, the road that got me there was not a straight one. I started off, I finished J school. I did some freelancing for a year. I think my first year out of J school, I made $11,000, which was not a lot of money, but I wrote stories that I cared about. Started with, I actually worked for a startup, which went under pretty soon after. Then I eventually got a job on the web desk with CTV, which is kind of like the news hub, I guess, of Canada. So, worked my way up through there, kind of did a little bit on the side in radio. And so I was working at CTV, and I eventually wanted to try to work for a newspaper. I obviously wanted to move on. And so I had a great job there. It was a union-protected job with a pension and pretty solid salary. And then I applied for like a summer internship, and I just wrote the ballsiest just most ridiculous letter, like to try to get the internship. I think it was about a paragraph and a half long, and something I've taken to people, which is, they're going to hire journalists, so make sure that what you write is interesting. Too many people just write these long, boring kind of letters. I just wrote this letter where I just said, I broke this story 2 weeks ago with a phone call. While writing 7 other stories that day. Imagine what I could do with the resources of the Globe. And they're just like, we're going to hire this guy. So they gave me a summer internship, and a couple days after the internship happened, a small a runaway oil train blew up in a small town and just pretty much just ripped the heart out of it, killed 47 people, just demolished it. And so my internship turned into me just living there. I moved there for about 3 or 4 months, and I just wrote lots of breaking news about it, like with the developments there. And then I ended up writing this massive feature where I tried to rebuild the last days of a lot of the people who died. So building their last days, they woke up in the morning, they did this, they went to this bar, they were having fun with their friends, they heard a screech outside, train explodes. This is the last moments of their life. And so my boss through that just said, don't worry about it, keep working and we'll find a job for you. And so, I did that. And then they moved me to Vancouver after that. And then I moved to Edmonton, Alberta, which is the capital of the western province of Alberta. And then I moved to Toronto, the big city, to do more politics. And then I moved back to Alberta, to Calgary, and I did some Montreal and some Halifax while I was there. This is the fun thing about working for a national newspaper is you move around a lot. And so it was a great gig. I mean, in terms of how I got into politics, I don't know, man. I never aspired to be, some political reporter. I think the jobs were kind of open, and I kind of fell into it. And I obviously had an interest in it, but and I still like it. You should know that your political editor is very happy to write about politics.
I was about to say, because you talk to most gallery journalists, and they're often like politicians in that they feel sort of slightly different to most other people, and that it just transfixed them from quite a young age, and that's not you.
No, I think the reason I like covering politics is it's because that's where important decisions are made. That's where so much of what impacts society is made. I grew up I have a fun upbringing where I was an English kid in an overwhelmingly French province. I grew up in a small town that was 99% French, 98% French Canadian, and 97% Roman Catholic, and I'm none of those. And the federal government has laws that protected people like me, and then I went to this small school, that just had no one there, and it once again was protected by laws. Otherwise, it wouldn't exist. And my parents were decidedly blue collar growing up. My dad was a welder. My mother ran a kind of under the table daycare. So I like politics because it's important to people like that. Because it not only does it help protect culture and help protect communities. Politics is also the way that you get to help people raise their kids. And I went to a high school where a lot of the people went to prison or went to the military or are just, have good blue-collar lives. So, which is very different from the old newspaper I used to work at, and it's frankly different from most of the people in the profession of journalism. And I like politics because you can speak directly to those causes, or not causes, but just life. It's just, it helps. You can make people's lives better if done right. And I think that's how I care about politics.
That's pretty moving, dude.
Yeah.
So the big Canadian political story that sort of exploded around the world over the last decade was Rob Ford, the crack-smoking mayor. You didn't cover that story, but you covered his brother, who was similarly colourful, not quite to the extremes of Rob. Do you want to tell us about that moment and how the first the Rob Ford story and then sort of refracting it, and how somehow this seemingly, it feels like having that on your family's resume should, if not disqualify from office, should make office unattainable, and yet Talk us through the Fords.
Yeah, and yet his brother is now like the second most powerful person in Canada after Justin Trudeau. The Fords are such an interesting family. Look, I never covered Rob, so all I kind of know is Rob Ford was one of these really these politicians that just you either loved or you hated, where he was the kind of guy who obviously had significant substance abuse problems, came off often as a bit of a jerk, but simultaneously he was the mayor of a city. Well, he was a mayor of a city of 4 million people. That's really the heart of a metropolitan area of like 7 million people. So just an insanely large area. And the guy would just give out his cell phone numbers to everyone. Like he was kind of like one of those like, common sense type of politicians where if you lived in social housing, community housing, which is pretty shambolic often in and around Toronto, and something had been broken and hadn't been fixed, Rob would drive up in his Cadillac Escalade and just like literally grab like 3 guys from Public Works and be like, fix it. And so people loved him. So they were willing to overlook his flaws. He was one of those guys that, he could get past it because he was authentic. And I know we use that word all the time, and I don't know what it means. I was talking to Chloe Swarbrick, who probably someone who has a similar claim to authenticity, and she kind of talked about her lack of media training. Yeah, no one has ever media trained Rob Ford. And his brother has similar attributes. His brother, who I covered a lot, I covered his rise into the premier's office. His brother kind of, same thing, bit of a loudmouth, had worked in a small business that may have been failing or may not have been. Loved to give his cell phone numbers out to people. His idea was, we'll roll up our sleeves, we'll fix the problem. Does not have any substance abuse problems. Bit of a teetotaler, vegetarian, which that was like one of those features that would blow people's minds. Like people would hate him, and I'd be like, oh no. They'd be like, all he's going to be is I'd meet people because I lived in this very lefty neighborhood in Toronto, and they'd be like, oh, he's going to be at the barbecue drinking beer and eating burgers. And I was like, oh, Doug Ford's a vegetarian. And he doesn't drink, so he's going to be having chocolate milk and like a tofu dog. And they were just like minds blown. But yeah, he was elected Premier of Ontario. He, which is the head of the province, massive province, really like half of Canada, really when you think about it. And he won it on that he was just, even though there were lots of things that people didn't like, and he was at the head of a big conservative machine. People were willing to overlook a lot of his flaws just because he seemed to be quite plain spoken. And I should add that if you think Jacinda's had a COVID-19 bump, like she's had nothing compared to Doug Ford, who prior to COVID-19, his opinion polling less than a year into office was just trash. It was like 19%, 18%. Most Canadian premiers are average about 50%. And so he's bounced from about 20-odd% to over 60% now, where he kind of and I'll wrap this up, but one of the interesting things about him was he had surrounded himself with some really bad people in his office, and they were really crappy people. And I actually had a lot of time for the guy. I thought he was really interesting. And one-on-one, I thought he was just this incredibly charismatic guy. And you kind of got a sense he was like your friend's dad, where he was just kind of like he wasn't – where just he said things without really thinking about them. And you don't really see that a lot in a politician. So I guess I was maybe sometimes too willing to forgive him. But the guy that you saw, that you talked to, and the guy who was the leader, just like it didn't come across. And it seems to have finally come across with COVID. And the thing that happened was, so the Toronto Raptors won the NBA championship.
It's incredible.
And Doug goes to give a speech in the heart of Toronto, and he gets booed. And the guy has no idea he's unpopular. And it just shatters him. And it's just like it was like his come to Jesus moment. And he's apparently tried – I mean, I haven't been there since, but he's tried to be a better leader since. And it's sort of the same thing happened with COVID, where he kind of did one or two missteps right at the beginning, realized that he screwed up, and has now just been like, I'll do whatever the science tells me to do. I'll listen to the doctors. Like, you do it right. And this guy who's just not a gifted communicator, who's just got so much folksy energy, seems to have finally found a way to do it, to kind of work it to his advantage.
Man, I feel there's so much more I want to talk about, but we're being given the wrap it up signal by Jane, our producer. I just want to leave on one last question, which is, what are you looking for? I mean, this campaign, this forever campaign, and like you said, you haven't had a day off since you landed in April or May. What are you looking forward to doing that you've been completely unable to do on the other side of the election?
Have a full weekend. That'd be nice. I should say, no, the Spinoff's actually really been quite good.
We'll take it. Actually quite good.
Actually good. What am I looking forward to doing? I'm looking forward to actually reading emails in the days that I get them. I'm looking forward to, I think I'm looking forward to getting to a point where my partner actually wants to talk to me about my job and doesn't just want to ignore what I've been doing that day, because it's always politics. And then I think I'm looking forward to, in a way, actually kind of, especially this week, kind of getting out of silly season and, rewinding to what I was telling you about 10 minutes ago. And like, once this is done, then once this campaign is over, we can finally start talking about important things again, like housing and, how to make New Zealand a better place, which just seems like such a weird way to look at an election campaign. But honestly, they all feel like this. It's the same thing in Canada, which is like, once the campaign's over, then we can finally start doing important things.
Yeah, well, I think we're all looking forward to that. Hey, thank you so much for coming up, Justin. We didn't even get to talk about your insane journey here and a whole bunch of other stuff. So I'll definitely have you back on the fold at some point later this year or early next. But yeah, thank you so much for coming up, and good luck surviving the next 48 hours.
Thanks, Ben.
That was The Fold, brought to you by our partners at oOh!media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa. Huge thanks to oOh!media for sponsoring this episode of The Fold and enabling us to make unmissable connections with Kiwis.
Ready to rediscover the joys of cycling? With over 300 kilometres of cycle paths across Tāmaki Makaurau, jumping on your bike and going for a ride is such a fun way to discover the city from a different perspective. Cycling is getting more and more popular across Auckland, so now's a great time to join the hype and give cycling a go. Head to at.govt/cycling to find your nearest cycleway today. The Spinoff Podcast Network.